Well, thank you, and good afternoon. You know, folks in Washington like to invoke President Reagan's name often when they criticize President Trump. They say, or at least insinuate, that Donald Trump is nothing like Ronald Reagan. They say the current president's approach is nothing like the vision championed by Ronald Reagan at the height of the Cold War, as we grappled with the Soviets and ultimately prevailed. But those folks are wrong. They're dead wrong. Most who invoke Ronald Reagan's name today, especially self-styled Republican hawks, are not much like Ronald Reagan. The policies they've championed are nothing like his. In fact, for the better part of 30 years, they've been quite the opposite. If you look at actual policies, Donald Trump is the true and rightful heir of Ronald Reagan. It's President Trump who has inherited and restored President Reagan's powerful but focused and realistic approach to national defense. It's therefore only fitting that we gather at the Reagan Presidential Library today to talk about President Trump's America First, Peace Through Strength, Common Sense agenda and what it means at the Department of War. One need only look at the results to understand why President Trump is that rightful heir. So let's look at what Reagan and his administration actually did. Reagan rebuilt the military after Vietnam, and that is rightfully considered one of his greatest achievements. President Trump has done and is doing the same, making historic investments in defense. But President Reagan also believed sincerely in the peace part of peace through strength, as his actions showed. It was not a popular thing to do at the time, at the height of the Cold War, to talk to communists. Yet President Reagan did. During his high-profile meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev and others, Ronald Reagan saw the prudence and potential in engaging with our nation's adversaries from a position of strength, so he did, even in the face of fierce criticism at home, including from his own party. Now, President Reagan wasn't naive. He recognized that fruitful engagements with our adversaries were only possible from a position of strength, especially military strength, which is why he focused so much on building up the American military. We still talk about the Reagan buildup, and my kids and yours will someday talk about the Trump buildup. President Reagan and his team inherited a military worn down from their generation's endless war in Vietnam, and they took the lessons of that war to heart. This is why he was so deliberate in how he used the joint force. Indeed, the most famous military doctrine of the Reagan administration, named for his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was specifically designed to correct for the failures that led to Vietnam. Among other key principles, the Weinberger Doctrine stipulated: 1, the United States should not commit forces to combat unless the vital national interests of the United States or its allies are involved. 2, U.S. troops should only be committed wholeheartedly and with the clear intention of winning. Otherwise, troops should not be committed. 3, U.S. combat troops should be committed only with clearly defined political and military objectives and with the capacity to accomplish those objectives. And 4, the commitment of U.S. troops should be considered only as a last resort. This is sound stuff, and it was reflected in how President Reagan actually used the American military, namely in a focused, decisive manner, and only when he determined that it was in our nation's vital interest to do so. In fact, throughout his time in office, President Reagan only committed U.S. ground forces twice, in Grenada and in Lebanon. Otherwise, he focused the joint force on the Cold War-era threat and priority theater, Soviets in Europe. That's how President Reagan achieved peace through strength, always with a clear eye toward lasting peace. Suffice it to say, Ronald Reagan's disciplined, focused, and realistic approach was a far cry from the grandiose, nation-building, moralistic, and rudderless wars that many of his self-described acolytes led us into in the decades after Reagan left office. Wars my generation fought in.